My name is Hannah Brooks. I'm 30 years old, and 3 days ago, while I was standing in my backyard outside Austin, trying to stop my little boy from sticking his fingers into his birthday cake before the guests arrived, the man who abandoned me as a teenager walked through my gate like he still had a place in my life. I hadn't seen my father in years, not at my high school graduation, not at my wedding, not when my son was born. He missed every important moment without hesitation. But somehow, on the one day that was supposed to belong completely to my child, he decided to show up uninvited and pretend time had erased everything he did. The truth is, the worst kind of betrayal is usually quiet. People imagine abandonment as screaming, slamming doors, and dramatic fights. Mine wasn't like that. My father didn't throw me out in anger. What he did was colder. He looked at me one day like I had become something heavy he no longer wanted to carry. Like I was an inconvenience. Like I was a problem he was tired of paying for. I spent years building a life that had nothing to do with him. A peaceful life, a stable life, the kind of life I used to dream about when I was younger and terrified of being left behind. So when I saw him standing near the balloons in my backyard, watching my son laugh with the other kids like he belonged there, something inside me completely froze. I stayed calm longer than most people probably could have. I let him speak. I let him act like we were some broken family finally reconnecting. And then he told me why he had really come. It wasn't because he loved me. It wasn't because he regretted anything. By the time he threatened me over $50,000, all I felt was certainty. And when I told him he had 5 minutes to leave my property, I meant every second of it. But before I tell you how my son's birthday turned into the day my father finally lost whatever control he thought he still had over me, you need to understand what happened when I was 16. That was the year I stopped believing adults when they called something temporary. My parents had already been divorced for a while, and my father had slowly started treating me like I was leftover baggage from a life he didn't want anymore. He had a newer house in the suburbs, a newer girlfriend, a newer routine, and a cleaner version of himself that somehow no longer had room for his daughter. At first, I kept making excuses for him. I told myself he was stressed. I told myself things would settle down eventually. I told myself parents didn't really stop caring about their kids. Then, one Thursday night in October, he stood in the kitchen holding his truck keys and a travel mug and told me I needed to start figuring life out on my own because he was done carrying me. He said it casually, like somebody canceling a subscription they forgot they even had. No yelling, no guilt, no apology, just a calm decision. I remember staring at him, thinking it would have hurt less if he had screamed. At least anger would have sounded emotional, but he was calm, completely calm, like getting rid of me was simply another task on his list. I asked him where I was supposed to go. He said I was smart enough to figure it out. I asked him if he was serious. He told me I was old enough to stop acting helpless. I asked about school, clothes, money, food, basic things a 16-year-old still needs. He shrugged and said I had always been dramatic. That was the night I learned something I never forgot. Being unwanted doesn't always sound loud. Sometimes it sounds quiet enough to break your heart slowly. He gave me 2 weeks. 2 weeks to pack my things, stop making his life harder, and disappear into whatever future I could manage for myself. I barely slept that night. The next morning at school, I sat through math and history classes feeling numb. I couldn't focus on anything. I didn't tell anyone at first because saying it out loud would make it real. But 2 days later, I completely broke down in the school parking lot after class. I was crying so hard I could barely breathe when my best friend Madison found me sitting beside my car. I told her enough for her to understand what was happening. That conversation changed my entire life. Her parents did something my own father refused to do. They listened, they asked questions, they looked horrified in the right places, and then they told me I could stay with them until we figured things out. I still remember carrying my duffel bag into their guest room feeling embarrassed beyond words. I apologized constantly. I kept promising I wouldn't be a burden. I kept waiting for somebody to change their mind. Nobody ever did. I finished high school from that house. I got a part-time job at a small coffee shop near campus and worked evenings and weekends. I learned how to smile through exhaustion, how to hide heartbreak behind routine, and how to survive disappointment without letting it destroy me. The Carter family never treated me like charity. They treated me like a teenager who deserved safety, dinner, structure, and a place to sleep without fear. That sounds simple until you grow up without it. My father never checked whether I made it to school, never asked if I needed winter clothes, never showed up to parent meetings or birthdays. Sometimes he'd send a random text saying things like, "Hope you're doing okay." But even those messages felt fake, more about protecting his image than actually caring about me. By the time I turned 18, I stopped waiting for him to become someone else. I went to community college because it was all I could afford. Later, I transferred to the University of Texas and slowly built my life one practical choice at a time. Nobody rescued me. I became stronger, more careful, more disciplined, very good at surviving disappointment. And when you grow up that way, you become protective of happiness. You don't assume good things will stay. You learn to guard them carefully. That's why what happened at my son's birthday affected me the way it did, because it was never just a birthday party. It was proof that I had finally built the kind of safe life my father once acted like I didn't deserve. By the time I reached my late 20s, survival had finally started turning into stability. After finishing college, I became a school counselor at an elementary school outside Austin. Looking back now, that job probably makes perfect sense considering my past. Kids can tell when an adult genuinely means it when they say, "I'm here for you." Families struggling through hard times can tell too. I never cared about being impressive. I just wanted to become the kind of steady person I used to need when I was younger. Somewhere during those years, I met Caleb. We met at one of the after-school family events I helped organize. His nephew attended the school, and while most people left the second the event ended, Caleb stayed behind helping us fold tables and stack chairs without being asked. That stood out to me. He was funny without trying too hard, dependable without turning it into some performance, and he had this calm way about him that made stressful situations feel manageable. He was the first man I had ever known who made reliability look natural instead of forced. The first time I told him about my father, he didn't interrupt me with advice or tell me I needed to forgive and move on. He simply said, "What happened to you was wrong." No excuses, no minimizing, just honesty. I think I loved him before I even admitted it to myself. We got married 4 years later on a warm spring afternoon in Texas, with close friends, the Carter family, and the few people in our lives who truly felt like family. My father wasn't invited. I didn't miss him. Then came Liam. Bright eyes, messy brown curls, nonstop energy, and enough questions to fill every quiet moment in the house. He's 6 now, and every birthday with him feels like proof that love can grow in places where fear used to live. Our house isn't huge, but it's warm. It has squeaky kitchen chairs, uneven grass in the backyard, toy cars under the couch cushions, and the kind of noise I used to dream about when I felt lonely as a teenager. On the morning of the party, Caleb was outside grilling burgers and hot dogs, while country music played softly through a portable speaker near the patio. I was tying balloons along the fence, while trying to stop Liam from stealing frosting off the cake before the guests arrived. There were juice boxes stacked in coolers, paper plates spread across folding tables, and one giant inflatable slide that had every kid screaming with excitement the second they saw it. It wasn't fancy, it was loud, messy, chaotic, and perfect.
Our neighbors came. A few parents from Liam's school showed up with their kids. Two of my coworkers brought their families. Madison arrived carrying extra wrapping paper and wearing the same amused smile she'd had since we were teenagers. Her mother hugged me so tightly I nearly cried, and her father immediately started helping Caleb move chairs around the yard, like party setup was his official responsibility. That's what real family feels like. The people who stay, the people who build with you, the people who never make you earn basic love. A few months before the party, I noticed something strange online. My father had found one of my public family photos and liked it. Then another. Then another. No message, no explanation, just those tiny digital reminders that he was watching from somewhere. I ignored it. I had no interest in reopening a door that took years to close. Then an older cousin I barely talked to sent me a random message asking whether I still lived near Austin. That felt connected too. I ignored that as well. I learned a long time ago that when people from that side of the family suddenly remembered I existed, it usually meant they wanted something. Still, I honestly never thought he would actually show up. Even selfish people usually understand that a child's birthday party is not the place to force yourself back into someone's life. I gave him too much credit. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, while kids were racing across the backyard and adults were talking near the grill, the side gate slowly creaked open. Before I even fully looked up, something inside me tightened. Then I saw him. Older, obviously, more gray around his temples, lines deeper around his mouth, a little heavier than I remembered, but I recognized him instantly. My father stood in the middle of my backyard holding a gift bag covered in cartoon tissue paper, like that somehow made him belong there. For one strange moment, everything around me kept moving normally. Kids screamed with laughter on the inflatable slide, someone asked Caleb where he bought the grill, a napkin blew across the grass, and my father smiled at my son like he had every right in the world to stand there watching him. I didn't run toward him. I didn't make a scene. Years earlier, I probably would have frozen completely, but motherhood changes something inside you. Once you have a child, your instincts become stronger than your fear. My first thought wasn't about anger, it was about control. How close was he to Liam? How many people were paying attention? Was he going to behave like a normal human being for 5 minutes or destroy the entire afternoon the second he opened his mouth? He lifted the gift bag slightly and smiled. "There she is," he said. Then he looked toward Liam and added, "And there's my grandson." Something about the way he said it immediately felt wrong. Not because it technically wasn't true, because it sounded possessive, like a claim. Caleb noticed the shift in my face immediately. He walked over from the grill and rested one calm hand against the middle of my back. My father introduced himself to Caleb like we were all meeting under perfectly normal circumstances, like 14 years of neglect had simply been some minor rough patch the family had naturally moved past. He told Caleb he was happy for us, told me he'd been meaning to reach out. Then he casually mentioned traffic being terrible, which would have been a bizarre thing to say, considering nobody had invited him. I remember thinking that some people lie so often they eventually start sounding comfortable doing it even while standing in places they absolutely do not belong. I quietly told Liam to stay near the slide with his friends before walking a few steps away from the party. Caleb followed beside me automatically, but I shook my head slightly. Not because I wanted to handle it alone, because I wanted to see exactly how far my father would go when he thought he still had access to me. He followed me toward the far corner of the backyard, near the fence, where the sounds of the party softened enough for private conversation. Up close, I could smell cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke underneath it. He looked me over carefully, the same way someone evaluates property before deciding what it's worth. Then his voice changed, suddenly calm, reasonable, the exact tone he used years ago whenever he wanted cruelty to sound practical. He told me I understood I was probably still upset about the past, but hoped enough time had passed for me to stop holding grudges. I almost laughed. Grudges are for small wounds. What he did changed my entire life. He said I'd heard I was doing well, nice house, good neighborhood, good husband, and he even said I looked happy, and every sentence sounded transactional somehow. Then he finally got to the point. He said he was having financial problems and needed my help. Not a small favor, not temporary assistance, $50,000. He said the number quickly, like saying it faster would somehow make it sound reasonable. For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. I asked him to repeat it. He did, this time with details. A business investment failed, partners betrayed him, the economy had hurt him, he had obligations, he needed money quickly. I just stared at him. He took my silence as encouragement and kept talking. He said I was finally in a position to do something meaningful for him. Meaningful. That word still makes my skin crawl. Then, because greed apparently wasn't ugly enough by itself, he wrapped it in guilt. He reminded me that he had fed me when I was younger, that he had paid for a roof over my head, that raising children costs money and sacrifice, and maybe now it was my turn to give something back. I felt my entire body go still.
I looked at him and said, "Are you seriously standing in my backyard during my son's birthday party trying to bill me for existing as your daughter?" He frowned immediately like I was being unreasonable. He told me I was getting emotional. He said he was only asking for fairness. Then he lowered his voice. And that's when everything changed. He leaned a little closer and said that if I refused to help him willingly, he was prepared to explore other options, legal options. He said it casually, but the threat underneath it was obvious. He mentioned family matters, courtrooms, complications I supposedly didn't want becoming public. And in that exact moment, something inside me settled completely. Not softened, settled. Every tiny piece of doubt disappeared right there beside the fence while children laughing less than 30 feet away. For one stupid second before that conversation, a small part of me had wondered if age had changed him. Maybe life had humbled him. Maybe time had forced him to become a better man. But standing there listening to him threaten me during my child's birthday party, I realized he was exactly who he had always been, just older. I looked him directly in the eyes and said, "You have 5 minutes to leave my property." He blinked like he genuinely wasn't expecting resistance. Then he smiled. I knew that smile. I had seen it years ago when I was young enough to believe adults automatically knew better than me. It was the smile of somebody convinced pressure always works eventually. He leaned closer and quietly said, "Hannah, don't do this in front of your little family." Like he had any right to say those words, like my home somehow existed for his convenience. I repeated myself, 5 minutes. His smile disappeared immediately. He should have left then. Any decent person would have. Even a selfish person with basic survival instincts probably would have realized they had pushed too far. But my father had always confused access with authority. He glanced toward the patio, where Liam was excitedly showing another little boy one of his new toy trucks. Then he looked back at me, and I could practically see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He thought the crowd gave him leverage. He thought my desire to protect the mood of the party would make me flexible. He thought being biologically related to my son gave him a role nobody could fully deny. He was wrong about all three. He said we should continue the conversation inside, where it was quieter. I told him no. Then he started walking toward the back door anyway. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just slowly enough to make it clear he had decided my boundaries were negotiable. I stepped directly in front of him. He immediately got irritated. "Hannah, stop acting crazy," he snapped quietly. "Leave," I said. "You're overreacting because I asked for a loan." "A loan?" I repeated. "You threatened me." He rolled his eyes like I was exhausting him. Any decent daughter would at least hear her father out. I still remember the heat of the Texas sun against my face, the smell of charcoal from the grill, and how surreal it felt standing there in a birthday dress while the man who abandoned me tried bullying his way deeper into my life. The second Caleb saw my father angle toward the house, he started walking toward us.
Madison noticed too. I could feel people around the yard slowly becoming aware that something was wrong. That shift always happens quietly first. Conversations soften, people glance over, adults start sensing tension even before they understand it. My father noticed he had an audience, and instead of backing off, he straightened his shoulders like a man preparing for a performance. Loud enough for Caleb to hear, he said, "I'm only trying to have a private conversation with my daughter. I don't appreciate being treated like some criminal." That's when I realized exactly what he was trying to do. He was trying to trap me inside politeness. If I stayed quiet, he could keep pushing. If I raised my voice, he could act victimized. If I walked away, he could wander closer to Liam and start introducing himself as grandpa to anybody listening. There are moments in life when you suddenly understand that staying polite is just another form of surrender. He tried stepping around me again. This time, I grabbed his wrist and stopped him hard. Not to hurt him, not out of revenge, to stop him, to make absolutely sure he could not take another step toward my child or my house. His skin felt thinner than I remembered. He jerked in surprise. I held his wrist firmly and said very clearly, "Do not take another step." Then I looked him dead in the face and added, "You have 5 minutes to get out before I call the police." Nearby conversations stopped instantly. Caleb was beside me now, solid and calm, not touching me but close enough that I could feel his presence. My father's face turned red. "Let go of me," he snapped. I didn't. He twisted too fast, trying to yank himself free, and winced immediately. When he finally pulled away, dark fingerprints were already forming around his wrist. He looked down at them like he had just been handed a winning lottery ticket. Proof, evidence, a weapon. Suddenly, he started talking louder, saying I assaulted him, saying he had only come to make peace, saying I was unstable. All he really accomplished was showing every adult nearby exactly who he was. Madison spoke first. "Nobody here is confused about what's happening," she said coldly. One of my coworkers quietly guided the kids back toward the inflatable slide so they wouldn't hear the conversation. Madison's father slowly stood from his folding chair with the calm energy of a man who didn't need to yell to end nonsense. My father looked around the yard and finally realized something important. The room he thought he controlled didn't exist anymore. This wasn't the frightened world I grew up in. This was my home, my people, a backyard full of adults who actually knew me, and that mattered more than blood ever would. Caleb finally spoke. "You need to leave, right now." My father pointed at me angrily. "This isn't over. You're going to regret humiliating me like this." Then his voice dropped lower. "If you want to play hardball, you have no idea what's coming." And with that, he backed toward the gate, still clutching the wrist he had nearly injured himself pulling away from me. Then he left. The gate slammed behind him. For several seconds, all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then life slowly started moving again. Someone lowered the music, someone else asked if I needed water, then Liam came running over, asking if it was finally time for cake and whether the adults were done talking. That nearly broke me. I smiled at him anyway because children shouldn't have to carry adult poison while they're still covered in frosting and sunlight. So we cut the cake, we sang happy birthday, we opened presents. I survived the rest of the afternoon entirely on instinct. The party didn't collapse, but something about the air had changed. It no longer felt innocent. After the last guests finally left and the backyard was covered in empty cups, torn wrapping paper, and half-deflated balloons, I sat at the kitchen table with Caleb and told him everything I hadn't been able to say earlier. Not just about the money, everything. The abandonment, the 2-week deadline when I was 16, the years of silence, the recent online messages, the way the threat today felt less like a surprise, more like an old pattern wearing a different face. Caleb listened without interrupting once. When I finally stopped talking, he reached across the table and held my hand. Then he quietly said, "He's never coming near Liam again." I nodded. But I still didn't fully understand how far my father was willing to go until 2 days later when I opened the mailbox and found a legal envelope with my name typed across the front. The second I saw it, I knew. Some instincts don't come from anxiety, they come from experience. The letter inside was from an attorney representing my father, and somehow, even after everything he had already done, reading it still made my stomach drop. The document claimed I was withholding $50,000 that supposedly belonged to him through prior family financial arrangements. I actually laughed once when I read that line, not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Family financial arrangements? That was the polished legal version of complete fiction. But the rest of the letter wasn't amusing at all. It suggested formal legal action if I refused to cooperate. It hinted at damages. It implied dishonesty. Every sentence was written in that cold, professional language designed to make nonsense sound expensive and dangerous. I stood in the driveway holding the envelope while the last piece of hesitation inside me burned away. Up until then, some part of me had still hoped the confrontation at the party was just a desperate outburst from a bitter man. Ugly, embarrassing, but temporary. Instead, he doubled down. He found a lawyer willing to stamp lies onto official paper and send them to the daughter he abandoned as a teenager. I walked inside without saying a word and placed the letter on the kitchen counter. Caleb read it slowly. Then he looked up at me with the kind of controlled anger that makes quiet men intimidating. He didn't tell me to ignore it. He didn't tell me my father was probably hurting. He didn't suggest family therapy or forgiveness. He simply said, "We're calling a lawyer today." By noon, we had a consultation scheduled with a family attorney in Austin named Rebecca Lawson. I liked her almost immediately, mostly because she didn't romanticize family conflict for even 1 second. She read the letter carefully, asked a few straightforward questions, and then leaned back in her chair. "This is weak," she said plainly. Then she tapped the paper. "And this isn't really about money, it's intimidation." Hearing someone else say that out loud felt strangely validating. Rebecca explained that people like my father often relied on emotional history more than actual evidence. They counted on fear, guilt, exhaustion, and shame to pressure the other person into settling quietly, just to make the problem disappear. Then she asked whether I had any records from my teenage years. At first, I almost said no, but then memories started opening inside my head like old drawers. I still had employment records from my first jobs, old school documents, financial aid paperwork showing no parental support, scanned emergency contact forms listing Madison's parents instead of my father, even old text messages from relatives casually mentioning how everyone knew he had basically started over without me. Madison remembered everything. Her parents remembered everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just emotional history anymore, it was documentation. Over the next 2 days, our dining room table turned into a battlefield made of paperwork and folders. I printed timelines, organized records, sorted old emails. Rebecca helped separate what actually mattered legally from what was simply painful. We weren't trying to tell my entire life story. We were building facts, solid ones, enough to make my father's claims look exactly as ridiculous as they truly were. And while we were doing that, the blocked phone calls started. At first, they came once or twice a day, then more. Voicemails, too. The first message sounded offended and self-righteous. The second almost sounded desperate. By the third voicemail, he was furious. He accused me of forcing him into this situation, said family should help family, said I could have solved everything quietly if I had just cooperated. Rebecca told me to save every single message. One voicemail especially mattered. In it, he said he hoped he wouldn't need lawyers, but after I embarrassed him publicly at the birthday party, I had left him no choice. There it was, the truth, almost directly from his own mouth. This was never about money he genuinely believed belonged to him. It was retaliation, punishment. He wanted control back after losing face in front of other people. Rebecca actually smiled when she heard that voicemail. She said, "Now we have motive." Around the same time, word about the birthday incident quietly spread through our social circle, not because I was publicly telling the story everywhere, because that's what happens when adults witness something disturbing at a child's birthday party and later compare notes. One of the moms from Liam's school texted asking if I was okay. A neighbor offered to provide a statement if necessary. Madison was furious in the uniquely protective way lifelong friends become furious for people they love. She told me my father looked exactly like the kind of man who still believed women could be pressured into obedience if he just kept talking long enough. I wish I could say all the support instantly made me feel powerful. It didn't. Mostly, it made me tired. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being dragged back into a version of yourself you fought hard to overgrow. A few nights later, after Liam fell asleep, I stood in his bedroom doorway longer than usual watching him breathe. I remember thinking how peaceful children look when they feel safe, and I promised myself the chaos would stop with me. Caleb found me standing there eventually. He wrapped one arm gently around my shoulders and asked if I was okay. I automatically said yes. He knew I was lying. Then he quietly said something that stayed with me. "You're not 16 anymore, Hannah." And he was right. At 16, I survived by accepting whatever scraps of safety people were kind enough to give me. At 30, I had a voice, a home, legal support, people who loved me without conditions attached. So when Rebecca suggested sending a formal response rejecting every claim and warning against further harassment towards my family, I agreed immediately. And when she suggested we might need to go one step further and make the truth harder for him to hide, I agreed to that too. My father wanted a fight built on secrecy and pressure. Instead, he was about to get one built on evidence. Rebecca's response letter went out Friday morning. It rejected every accusation completely, demanded all future communication go through legal counsel, and warned that continued harassment towards my family would lead to escalation. For the first time since my father walked into my backyard, I felt something close to relief. Not because things were over, because the situation had finally moved out of the shadows, where men like him usually do their best work. Still, I knew my father, and one thing about him had always been true. He hated losing privately as much as he hated losing publicly. So before he could twist the story into something useful for himself, I made a decision that would have terrified the teenage version of me. I told the truth. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just honestly. I wrote a calm post on my personal Facebook page explaining that the man who abandoned me as a teenager had appeared uninvited at my son's birthday party, demanded $50,000, threatened legal action after I refused, and was now pursuing false claims after years of avoiding any real parental responsibility. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't insult him. I didn't tell people how to feel.
I simply told the truth, the way adults do when they finally stop being afraid of how ugly someone else's behavior looks in daylight. Then I locked my phone and set it face down on the kitchen table. The response came faster than I expected. Friends from college commented first, then neighbors, then parents from Liam's school, then people who had known pieces of my story for years but never understood the whole thing all at once. Some messages hit harder than others. One mother I barely knew wrote that she was grateful my son would grow up watching healthy boundaries instead of guilt and manipulation. Another message came from a former student of mine who was in college now. She reminded me of something I once told her during a counseling session after a difficult situation with her own family. Love without safety isn't real love. I sat there, staring at that message with tears in my eyes, because sometimes the advice you spend years giving other people becomes the exact advice you still need to choose for yourself. By that evening, relatives had started reaching out too. Not all of them kindly. A few told me to remove the post because family problems should stay private. That argument has always fascinated me. People suddenly become passionate about privacy when the truth embarrasses the wrong person. But not everyone defended him. Two relatives I hadn't spoken to in years privately admitted they weren't surprised by any of it. One even told me my father had destroyed relationships with multiple people over money and pride long before he ever came after me. Then something happened that my father absolutely never expected. The woman he had been living with contacted me directly. Her message was short, careful, and obviously shaken. She told me she knew our relationship was strained, but she never understood the depth of what had happened between us. She also said she had no idea about the legal threats or the money demands. Then she thanked me for being factual instead of cruel. That part stayed with me.
A week later, Rebecca called and told us my father's attorney wanted to discuss quietly dismissing the claim. Quietly, that word again. This time, we weren't interested in helping him disappear the consequences neatly. Rebecca demanded full written withdrawal of every claim, along with confirmation that no future legal action would be pursued. She also requested reimbursement for part of the legal costs connected to the filing. At first, they resisted, then they folded, because there was never a real case. There had only been ego, humiliation, desperation, and the mistaken belief that I would still react like the scared 16-year-old he once discarded with 2 weeks' notice. The claim was officially withdrawn, the legal letters stopped, the blocked phone calls stopped, and because my father couldn't tolerate the damage spreading through his own social circles, he eventually posted a carefully worded public statement online pretending he regretted misunderstandings and hoped for peace within the family. It wasn't an apology, it was reputation control. But by then, it didn't matter anymore. People already knew. His wrist healed, his image didn't. Several relatives quietly distanced themselves from him after hearing the full story. One business contact he used to brag about apparently backed away after learning enough to question his judgment. And the woman he built his newest life around eventually left him too. But more important than any of that, he lost access to the fantasy he had carried for years. The fantasy that he could walk back into my world someday and automatically be treated like a father simply because we shared blood. That illusion finally died, not because I screamed louder than he did, not because I destroyed him, but because I stopped protecting him from the consequences of who he had always been. Life slowly settled after that, not instantly, but steadily. Caleb and I started taking one evening every week for ourselves after Liam went to bed. No legal conversations allowed. Madison still jokes that she wishes she had sold tickets to what she calls the worst birthday guest appearance in Texas history. Her dad still checks in on me more than most biological relatives ever have, and her mom still reminds me that asking for help is not weakness, which is something I'm finally starting to believe. As for Liam, he's still happily being Liam. He remembers the balloons, the inflatable slide, the birthday cake, the toy trucks. He doesn't remember the man who walked through the gate that afternoon, and if I can help it, he won't remember him for a very long time. The biggest lesson in all of this isn't that revenge feels satisfying. Honestly, revenge had very little to do with it. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stand still, tell the truth clearly, and refuse to let someone rewrite history simply because enough time has passed. Family isn't defined by who created you. Family is defined by who protected you, who stayed, who showed up when leaving would have been easier, who made you feel safe instead of small. For years, I thought my father took something from me that I would spend the rest of my life trying to replace. Now I understand something different. By becoming the exact kind of parent I needed and never had, he accidentally taught me what kind of home I would never allow around my son. And maybe that's the only useful thing he ever gave me. If there's any value in a story like mine, maybe it's this. You are allowed to close the door on people who only remember you when they need something. You are allowed to choose peace over guilt. You are allowed to build a life so healthy and honest that the people who once broke you no longer recognize the strength standing in front of you. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to remember this. Protecting your peace is not selfish, and setting boundaries with people who hurt you does not make you a bad person. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from the people who only value you when they need something from you. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to hear where you're watching from and what part of the story stayed with you the most. See you in the next story.